Welcome to Teaching Truth. It's an action-packed, it's an exciting, it's a gripping, it's a dynamic and fascinating account. The account of Peter walking on the water with Jesus. And today in our reflections, we want to, as it were, dive into the sea and look at the reality of the situation that the disciples and Peter in particular encountered. But before we do that, let's dive into the passage in Matthew chapter 14 and, as it were, swim through it together. Immediately Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side while he dismissed the crowd. After he had dismissed them, he went up on a mountainside by himself to pray. Later that night he was there alone, and the boat was already a considerable distance from land, buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it. Shortly before dawn, Jesus went out to them walking on the lake. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. "It's a ghost," they said, and cried out in fear. But Jesus immediately said to them, "Take courage, it is I. Don't be afraid." "Lord, if it's you," Peter replied, "tell me to come to you on the water." "Come," he said. Then Peter got down out of the boat, walked on the water, and came to Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid and, beginning to sink, cried out, "Lord, save me." Immediately Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. "You of little faith," he said, "why did you doubt?" And when they climbed into the boat, the wind died down. Then those who were in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." The reality of the situation is this, that Jesus had told and made his disciples get into the boat. Now the disciples, most of them were fishermen. They would have known what the lake was going to be like. They would have no doubt looked at the weather forecast for the next few hours. They would have seen that a storm was brewing. And so, being fishermen, they would probably have said, "Jesus, let's just wait here till morning, till it calms down." But no, Jesus made them get into the boat. He sent them into the Sea of Galilee when it was dark and when the weather was atrocious. And Jesus left them and went up on a mountain to pray. Why? Well, quite simply, because Jesus often and indeed sometimes deliberately sends us into storms. Because it's only and often in storms that, like the disciples and like Peter in particular, we find greater intimacy with Jesus and can see and experience the greatest miracles. That's exactly what happened to Peter in this account. The reality of the situation is this, that the disciples were in the boat. The wind was blowing a gale and the waters would be tossing the boat up and down. And suddenly they look out on the waters and see what they think is a ghost, and they're terrified. Now, they would have known Jesus, they had walked with Jesus, they had eaten with Jesus, and yet Jesus is walking to them on the water. Why did they not recognize him? Well, the answer is in the passage. The reality of the situation is they were terrified. Fear and being terrified can blind us to seeing Jesus and to seeing who he really is. That was the reality of the situation for the disciples. But note what Jesus says to them. Here's the reality of Jesus' words. Take courage. It is I. Don't be afraid. Now, coupling those words together, take courage and don't be afraid, are those three hugely significant words. It is I. You see, when they heard Jesus' voice, the fear subsided because they knew Jesus was in control. That was the reality of the situation for them. When Jesus speaks, fear goes and faith comes. The reality of the situation also, as we'll discover as we dive further into the sea of these reflections in coming weeks, is that Peter got very excited. Peter was the spontaneous disciple, the one who, as it were, allowed his heart to rule his head. And Peter said, Lord, if it's you, tell me to come to you on the water. And when Jesus said, come, Peter probably thought, oh no, I've got to follow through on what Jesus just said to me. Why did I open my big mouth in front of these 11 other disciples? Peter got out and started walking on the water. And we know the rest of the story, that he took his eyes off Jesus. He looked at the waves and began to sink. Lord, save me, Peter cried out. And what did Jesus do? Jesus didn't dive in. Jesus didn't don a life jacket. Jesus stretched out his hand. Isn't Jesus good? And isn't Jesus kind? Jesus did not condemn Peter and say, you idiot, you fool, for stepping out of the boat. He actually commended him and supported him. The reality of the situation for the disciples is that they were out on that sea. They experienced many emotions, and they were in a situation where they saw a miracle taking place. And the reality of the situation for Peter is that he experienced the exhilaration of walking on water with Jesus. And likewise, for us, we will never experience spiritually the exhilaration of walking on water with Jesus unless we step out of the boat.